Well, Jay, it is time for another special episode of the podcast. And on this particular episode, we're going to talk with Nathan McCartney. Now, we mentioned his article, I think it was 2 weeks ago or a week ago, a really interesting post that he wrote, which was First Week Sales in Music, the Most Misleading Stat. And it's fun to have him on the show now.
Yeah, we had a really good conversation. He really talks about the importance of understanding the intention behind music consumption metrics and how they can mislead both fans and industry professionals. He also points out that catalog music now represents, a significant portion of the music industry, often outperforming new releases, in terms of consumption. So now, without further ado, here's Nathan McCartney. Let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand!
Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air, on the air, on the air, on the air, on the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Hey, Nathan.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
I saw the Verizon thing, the Rock Nation thing. Tell me about you.
Well, first of all, I just want to say congrats. I mean, this world is so tough to build anything and stay consistent with anything. So the extent of saying, hey, I'm going to follow my curiosity, and here we are a decade later, 15 years later, 25,000 people later, and it's having impact where people are reaching out and saying, hey, let me give you a different perspective, or let's chat about this or cover that. Like, that's really important. I think it's almost fitting when we talk about like first week sales. It's like the same thing you're doing. What if you were judged on the very beginnings or the infancy of your product or what your curiosity was? So I think that in itself is just kind of really interesting as far as like the dedication to seeing something through because you love what you do. I've been around the space, kind of insider but outsider at the same time for the large majority of my career, meaning I'm not like a traditional record label person. I haven't necessarily worked on the biggest acts or their campaigns, but I have been kind of close to the business and a lot of times where the money is flowing to. The abbreviated story is I dropped out of college to work for Damon Dash and Kareem Biggs Burke. They were splitting up. Rockefeller at the time, they were Jay-Z's two original partners. And the staff kind of had a choice in which direction they wanted to go. And a lot of folks went with Jay. And these guys had reached out and said, hey, you want an opportunity, here it is. So I ended up doing that for a few years, got exposed a little bit to the kind of guerrilla marketing style of the music business, but also saw that their portfolio included a lot of things that were outside of music. So they were trying to do film. I shouldn't say trying, they were doing films. They were doing alcohol. Damon's wife at the time had a pretty big clothing line called Rachel Roy. They had the license for Proked. So just got exposed a lot to the various aspects of cultural marketing and kind of cross promotion and mixing kind of like music with lifestyle with other businesses that had higher margins, and was just really fascinated by it. And oddly enough, the person who had originally reached out to me and ended up going with Jay was a guy named John Bartleston. And John had reached back out after a few years while I was with Dame because I had his old computer, and he said, "Hey, I think the future of the music business is in mobile. I'm going over to Nokia. I don't know what you're doing, but I know these guys at Verizon. You should give it some thought." And
Like what year was that? Like what era?
yeah, so this is 2007.
Yeah.
Um, so I was like, Verizon, that doesn't sound cool. Like, what, Verizon music business? I'm good on that. So, after some time, he had put me with them. We went back and forth, and I went over there as kind of like a contractor, and they had a small, nimble team. And, based out of Baskin Ridge, New Jersey, which is where their headquarters were. And quickly, I got to start learning about how the money aspect of the business really works. And it was just super interesting being exposed to the meetings, licensing ringtones, ringback tones, the
Yeah.
original MP3 deals with Rhapsody, and just kind of being on the forefront of this digital shift
Sure.
post Napster. Um, and the most interesting part and kind of mind bending at the time was Verizon quickly started generating hundreds of millions of dollars for the music business, and becoming pretty important, next to iTunes. We were number one for mobile, number two for digital,
Yeah.
but it meant very little internally, meaning the 350 million we did in revenue was a drop in the
Yeah.
bucket to this
A rounding error. Yeah.
100%. So that was just kind of exposure to like, hey, how does big business work? This is kind of like a ancillary benefit for Verizon customers being able to service them with ringtones and ringback tones. But that's it.
Yeah.
It's not a bigger thing. And it was just so interesting to me when, you're sitting with the likes of Jim Urey and Amanda Marks and, these people who are running the distribution arms of these companies, and it means a lot to them. And they're saying, hey, come see this artist. We want to play you this music. We want to get you excited about this, because we were sponsoring Taylor Swift's early tours, Jonas Brothers, Keith Urban. We went and got a mobile recording studio for Timberland, and he would get on a couple times a month and create an exclusive song just for Verizon. And he was working with Chris Cornell from Soundgarden at the time and doing his album. Just stuff that made you love music
Yeah.
and be excited as, someone who was still in their youth, and like, it wasn't about the numbers. It was the love of the music. Um, so the abbreviated story was I was there for 7 years. A lot of the people who started the music group moved on to do more important things at the company, and I got to end up having a leadership role in it, and working on the licensing deals with the early DSPs as the business moved from ownership to access. So RDIO, Mog, Rhapsody, and then Spotify, and
Yeah.
who gets preloaded on devices, working with the OEMs and our product team to figure that, and just really learning about how the money works, and the importance of carrier billing, and the most valuable real estate in the world for a lot of these companies is that little icon on your home screen on the device. So did that, got really friendly with a bunch of artists through the way, helping them, and just kind of seeing the same way you were talking about aggregating articles, working with different content aggregators who are starting to get artists that I was fans of music on Verizon, which was really tricky. And I was like, man, like this guy Ryan Leslie, he wants to go direct, and this guy Nipsey Hussle, he's getting off Epic, and I can put him with IOTA, or someone else we have a direct deal with, and he can see a higher percentage. And the Orchard before they were bought from Sony, like, so just starting to get a little bit more curious about these opportunities.
Yeah.
And through that, I got really close with this guy Ryan Leslie, who I just mentioned, and Ryan was a bit of an anomaly. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but his story is it's amazing. 1600 on his SATs at age 15, graduated from Harvard at 19, gave the oration speech, wanted to do music, took out a loan from his dad. His dad said, "You have 1 year, and then you got to become a doctor or a lawyer." He came to New York, made a beat. The first beat he ever made that got placed was for Beyonce and the Bad Boy 2 soundtrack. Puff Daddy starts managing him. He becomes a member of the Hitmen, and through that, he starts dating a model. He writes and produces her album, signs it to his production company, and her name is Cassie. And yeah, Cassie, kind of took off. Shortly thereafter, she started dating Diddy. Ryan went on to do a couple albums on Motown, one of which was Grammy nominated. But it was interesting for him because he saw that his first album did much better than the second album. And when he went and sat with the folks at Motown, he said, why didn't we just hit all the people who bought the first album and told them the second album is out? It's only been a year. And they said, well, we don't know who these people are. Wait, so you don't know who buys my album on iTunes? Starts doing more research. Wait, I don't know who's coming to my shows. Wait, when Nate's pushing my ringtones at Verizon, I don't get any of that data. So he and I started a company called Superphone. The whole premise was owning the relationship with your customer. We went and raised some money from Ben Horowitz, who runs Andreessen Horowitz, a guy named Klaus Hummels, who was on the board at Spotify and Facebook, and just kind of like a who's who of the tech world and some music folks as well. And really what it was an automated system where you could text Ryan directly. It would run you through some smart automation, say, hey, Jay, just got your text. What's your email? Once we had your email, we'd run it across Shopify, WooCommerce, Magenta, different D2C platforms, and we'd see if you ever bought anything before. If not, we might invite you to, or we might say, hey, text me anytime and start building a relationship. And we go to different cities and he would text his top fans because he could segregate them on money spent, invite them to dinner, no strings attached, and just build this community aspect. So did that for a few years, realized it's really tough to build a tech company. It's even tougher building one with an active artist. And I transitioned out, jumped over to Rock Nation. A good friend of mine was joining as president, and he said, hey, start this with me. So worked over there for a couple years, built out their distribution arm, which was called Equity Distribution and is now Rock Nation Distribution. They kind of merged the label and the distribution arm. And I got the bug again, built a tech product with a couple buddies, which was kind of like the inverse of TikTok. So TikTok, you take a fixed media asset, which is a song, and you shoot a music video to it. What we would do is we would pull in viral clips and allow people to remix them with their voice, audio, or text. So, think of it as like a richer GIF. So if I'm running late to this, maybe I send you a video of like a car chase, and I'm like, yo, Jay, be on in a minute. Just got to handle something real quick. Showed some folks at Snapchat. They said, hey, you should take this serious. If you do, we'll throw you some money. So spent a summer working out of their office in Venice Beach, got some exposure to Evan and Bobby, the co-founders of the company, and raised millions of dollars behind it. And once again, got to play around with doing some licensing deals with the majors and on some short-term licenses and get exposed to that again. And, gave it a 5-year run, couldn't get it over the hump. And since then, I've just kind of been doing the bag and doing some consulting and music that keeps me kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
I love it. And I know a lot of these things that you talked about. I mean, I used to work with Jim and Amanda, and I remember when Mastertones were just a beast for us, and we crossed like 1 million of Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On. And you brought up something that was seldom talked about, and that is that it was a big deal for us, but not a super big deal for a carrier, because of the amount of revenue. Well, let's jump into your piece. Now, tell me about the bag, because I'm sort of new to your work on Substack. I found this article. The headline was First Week Sales in Music, the Most Misleading Stat, and that immediately grabbed my attention. But then I read the article, and then I read it again because it's dense. There's a lot of information in there. And what I noticed, what really helped me sort of wrap my head around what you were conveying was the graphics, which were really well done. Tell me a little bit about the bag and about this piece and about your work sort of, on Substack.
Yeah, so, during COVID, I was still working on that other startup. And one of the things that, I mean, it's the primary function of a founder when you have a startup is raising capital, being in the game long enough to survive. And we get close with a lot of big firms, but we couldn't get them over the hump. And one of the things I just kind of realized was to get people to care about what you care about, you kind of have to have a raised profile. And at the same time, my own curiosity, I was just doing research on different things, going down deep rabbit holes. And I just felt like a lot of the articles I would read in the music business, because I read a lot, covered
Mhm.
the same subject matter, or they would only get to a certain level of depth. And the information I was looking for, which was really more about the economics, I wasn't finding it readily available. And it exists, but you got to be willing to go a little deeper. So, whether that's listening to podcasts, whether that's pulling on a thread, piecing together multiple articles, trying to compare notes and stuff like that. So, really, the bag was the origination of it was just chasing my own curiosity. And I just figured that if I was curious about these things, maybe other people were too. So, I do some tweet threads, I do a couple posts on LinkedIn, and really wasn't getting any engagement. And so, um, there's a platform called Behance, which is really just kind of like an Instagram for designers where they can showcase their work. And I went on it and, I started taking note of people's work that I liked. And I'd send them messages and say, hey, I'm curious about certain things. I'll pay you to do graphics on it. And it's like anything else. I literally would message 20, 30 people. And suddenly it got to like 100 and only one replied. And she worked with me for a couple years. So I would pay her to do graphics on the things that I was curious about. And I started doing it, writing these little newsletters, couple graphics at a time, just looking at different things that I thought were interesting. And people would share it, and I get some feedback and stuff like that. And then kind of fast forwarding to not this past August, but the August of 2024, I was at the end of the road with the startup. Just wasn't going to happen, so we decided to shutter it. And I said, all right, well, why don't I start posting a little bit more consistently and see what happens? And you know, went from 1,000 in August of last year to 57 or 58,000 now, and
Nice.
yeah, and even less about like who the sheer number of followers and more about who's following. Similar to what you were saying before about like people reaching out, Bruno or whoever, like
Yeah. Yeah.
I know that name because he follows the bag. So you start seeing these different executives um, that kind of have name cachet and stuff like that in the business, and then different people whose writing I respect at different outlets, ranging from the Wall Street Journal to Billboard to Hits, whatever. It's catching their attention as well. So really, it's just been based on my curiosity. I don't necessarily have an agenda other than to look for truth and find stories that I think are interesting and then try and share them in a way that's easily digestible so that other people can better understand them or correct me if I've got it wrong.
Right. And I like that you said easily digestible because let's face it, we love to read, you and I do, but not everybody does or has the time. And so you need to sort of do the executive summary and you need to have some of these graphics to sort of wrap your head around it. You started off the piece by saying that, art is now judged by performance before it's even consumed. Fans, critics, and media personalities weigh in on first week sales and pass judgment sometimes without even listening to the music. And that really resonated with me. Talk a little bit about that and how, as you started to see this shift in metrics, that first week sales might be more of a vanity metric today.
I listen to a plethora of artists and I really like looking into the numbers and just seeing how things are commercially done. But it's just so interesting to me, and part of it is probably my own fault. My algorithm is just filled with nonsense around like first week sales and things like that. And obviously, we train our own algorithm. So that's my fault for engaging or looking at that content, but it's just insane to me when I see people on X or even on Instagram or just different social media places saying that this album isn't good because it sold this. Not the music, I didn't it didn't resonate with me. Not it felt like it was sloppy. It sounds like everything else out. It's because it sold this. And I'm just like, wow, like if that's the case, then I guess my newsletter sucks. I guess my Instagram page sucks because it's just, they're pages with millions of followers or millions of newsletter subscribers. So, I just think that we're in a world now where everyone is so quick to compare things or put things in a box, give it a status symbol versus actually judging it on the quality of the material. And that's a dangerous game because it just makes it a lot tougher for things to catch the attention and especially important things because, people are just judging it on commercial performance on 1 week, 52 weeks in a year, albums, we can get into it later, but, there's a Fleetwood Mac album that's constantly in the top 50 that's 50 years old. Like, these things, the game is different now. Uh,
Yeah, we're not really talking about the first week numbers of that Fleetwood Mac, but I thought it was really important because we're looking at consumption, and as well as anyone, the TEA and SEA that we talk about on the podcast all the time, and equivalence and things like that. And you mentioned it a moment ago, we went from ownership to access. Talk a little bit about the impact of streaming and how that's affected and fundamentally changed the way that we not only release music, how fans engage in it, but how we sort of measure success.
yeah, well, I think part of this too that, you kind of have in an older guard, meaning like they came from the music business pre-streaming. And I think there are a lot of folks who probably feel strongly about like the spirit behind buying a physical product and the intention behind it. And then there's a lot of folks now who look at it like, oh, it's streams, it's 4/10 of a penny or whatever they want to claim the rate is. And like, that's not valuable. And just trying to put these like connotations around like bots and all these things. And
Mm-hmm.
the truth of the matter is like for the top artists, whether it was back in the day or today, there is a lot of money in music. And now the middle layer and the bottom layer, that gets a little trickier and the streams need to add up. But it's just this thing where it's like we came from this world where it was based on scarcity and hey, there's only so much shelf space. So you needed a label because they had those relationships with the retailers to ensure shelf space. And there's only so much inventory, there's only so much amount of time your product's going to stay there. So that meant a lot. Now it's hey, anyone can be up on Spotify in seconds, minutes, whatever it takes to get it up. And it's an infinite shelf space. So for me, like there are songs that are charting in the top 50 globally on Spotify that I don't come across for months. And it's just I'm late to the game. So I just think it's so interesting nowadays where all of our attention is divided. It's not just divided across music. It's right now I could be on the phone with Jay talking about this. I could be scrolling through the Instagram. I could be walking my dog. I could be doing all of these different things. And artists have to compete with that. They have to compete with your attention. And not only that, they're competing with catalog. So it gets really tricky. And I think, just the fact that we're judging people in such a small timeline,
Yeah.
uh, and their art, it doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah. And you just talked about catalog, which I thought was fantastic because that's what's driving the business. And you point that out in your piece. Talk about the differences that you see between like catalog and frontline and, sort of the implications of this shift from, emerging artists to established stars.
Yeah, it's not even, I don't think I put it in this newsletter, and I can't remember if I ever did, but I was looking at Miguel Adorn. It's a song he put out in like 2010, 2011. And it's funny, the song will have moments on TikTok and stuff like that over the years. But in looking at the consumption for the song, mind you, it started in the digital era, still digital downloads like 2010. Streaming really took off like mid 2014, 2015, 2016. This song's biggest year ever was like 2 years ago, and it's still going a couple million units a year. And the marketing for this song is stopped a long time ago. I'm sure the label has stopped throwing money at it. It's not being worked at radio. I'm guessing, but I have a pretty good hypothesis on that. And it's just like, hey, the lifeline of this song is because it's a great song. People keep listening to it and going back to it, whether it's nostalgia, whether it's whatever. And we see this all the time when you look at what's charting and what's not. I mean, like Hamilton 10 years later, a Broadway show with the soundtrack is crushing it. It's still doing 25, 30,000 units a week 10 years later. Goo Goo Dolls, Iris, Slide, Coldplay, Bruno Mars, like people continue to go back and listen to what they love. And I think, Spotify and the DSPs, but particularly Spotify, get a bad rap a lot of times. But I will say that they've given new lifelines to a lot of catalogs because they just make it so simple to find what you love. And because of that, the business takes notice, and you have UMG partnering with Cord and the Dundee family office. You have, Sony spending a couple $billion. You have Warner talking about their partnership with Bain. And that's because they're going to buy iconic catalogs with proven revenue streams that are going to continue to be listened to for time because that's what makes money for them. And that's a lot safer than taking bets on Frontline.
Yeah, you just talked about two things I think are really fascinating. One is sort of discovery versus rediscovery. And the other part of it is catalog is a majority of the music industry. It's like 2/3 of the music industry. But if you look at the data, it's really in the last 5 years that what they call a catalog, because as you know, anything over 18 months is considered catalog. But it really speaks to your point when, whether it's, some of these examples that you're using, it feels like sometimes it takes people a moment to get into it. Sometimes there are viral moments, sometimes there aren't. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of time because you have this onslaught of all of these releases coming at you all the time. Back when it was just the retail that you talked about, we didn't have that. We were kind of force fed what was on the radio, maybe what was on MTV, maybe, when you see that at retail. Talk about how these conversations go when you talk to people about, it's not all about these new releases that first week, that you really need to step back and look at, well, how is this performing a year to 5 years from street date?
It depends on who you're having the conversation with, right? I interact with some different music funds who, they're looking at proven revenue streams, like I alluded to, like the majors. So for them, they don't care necessarily how something performed in the first week. They're looking at how the vintage is doing. How's it compare against other genres in that vintage? Has it hit its steady stay? Like, what does that decay curve line look like? Things like that to put kind of like a value on it if they're looking to acquire or partner with the artist, producer, or songwriter on that catalog. The label, I mean, just looking at kind of some of the responses to the piece, I think a lot of people know these things, but at the same time, they're caught up in a game. And, the game's going to keep going unless we can find a way to change the narrative. And to that extent, it's like data without context is very misleading. And that was kind of like the point of the piece, which is like we're comparing albums that might have 25, 30 tracks on them to EPs because they've both came out the same week or they're both judged by the same thing. We're comparing albums that put out 6 songs beforehand over a couple years versus albums that had no singles out beforehand. We're comparing albums that had 20 variants versus some that had just one. So it's like there are all these different things at play. And, the label's job is to commercialize a product and drive the most revenue for it. And, I say this respectfully, exploit it in the best possible manner. But, the fans and the different people don't necessarily know all the contextual things about that because they don't know that, hey, you know what, Somber, who did 27,000 first week, is being judged against Stray Kids, who have 7, 8 members in the group and 20 variants on their album. Somber wrote his whole album. He produced his whole album. It's 10 tracks. It's a debut. And to me, it's like, wait, that guy also, I believe, has a licensing deal. Even if he did a much smaller unit percentage in that time, he might be doing better financially. Like, so you have these different components that I think people, just aren't abreast of. And that's fine because you're consumers. You're supposed to judge it on the quality of the music, not because of the things I just mentioned.
Yeah, and one of the things you point out in the article is how the system is sort of gamed or optimized for these new rules. We always say it's not fraud, it's marketing. But one of the things that really struck me is how important chart positions are to labels still. And I'll see people touting things like, oh, this was #1 on iTunes EDM chart. Like iTunes, like downloads was that 20 downloads?
Yeah.
But it's like they need that pull quote to put into their marketing to say that we hit this chart position. But there's really not a lot of context around it.
That was one of the other things I tried to kind of underscore a little bit is some of these metrics are just status symbols and signal to say, hey, this artist is still relevant in the marketplace. You should check them out. And I understand that thinking, similar to what you just said there, excuse me, for superstar artists or legacy artists to say, hey, you know what? They still exist. They still mean something. Check out their music. But for artists who are still emerging and still being discovered, that stuff means very little, at least to me, in my opinion.
Yeah. So where do you see sort of the future of music consumption? There's a lot of rapid changes about how music is consumed, marketed. What do you think the music industry may need to do as we go forward to sort of adapt to, the way that music is consumed today and, to track it, reward it, tout it, what's going on, but something that reflects how it's really consumed going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I don't have all the answers. I've never really investigated like how we came up with 1,250 streams, or 3,750 on ad free. Like, I don't know how those numbers correlate or like what the rationale behind them was. But I think in general, what I see is just we need to look at things under different lenses and understand like what is the intention behind them. And it's funny, I was looking at Zach Bryan this morning. Um, I'd been thinking about him a little bit with the his new song that talks about ice and some of the things that are going on. And I was looking at his Spotify and his monthly analytics say, hey, he has 26 million monthly listeners, which makes him 239th in the world. And then I was looking and his biggest first week sales for an album is 200,000. But this guy just played and headlined the biggest ticketed show in the US in history, 112,000 people at Michigan Stadium, moved $5 million in merch. But if we looked at it just under the lens of, hey, his first week sales or how he compares on Spotify ranking, you would think that there are plenty of other artists doing way better than him. And it's just all relative to me. It's like, how do you want to look at this? Because to me, you just made history and moved millions of dollars of merch, and that's kind of signal that your music is resonating in the community. People want to hear it. People traveled to go to Ann Arbor to listen to this 7-hour show. Um, that means a lot more than, yeah, hey, he did 200,000 first week. You know, are that many people going to go listen to the Jack Boys? they did 251,000 first week. I don't know, but I don't think so based on this being the biggest show in US ticketed history. So I just think we need to look at things with context versus just a single statistic, to understand the trajectory of an artist's career and what they're trying to build and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I loved your piece because it really opened up that conversation. And sort of my takeaway is you can't just look at a simple one line stat and understand if that's successful. Is it not successful? Is it good for its genre or mood? There's so much more that goes into it. Nathan, I'd love to have another conversation with you. We could talk for hours. Your piece, First Week Sales in Music, the Most Misleading Stat. We thought it was really great. If you check out the episode that dropped this morning of the Your Morning Coffee podcast, it's our lead story. We'll be talking about this more as we go forward, but tell our listeners, where can they find you? Where can they subscribe? Where can they read The Bag? Where can they learn more about you, Nathan?
Sure. So on Instagram, it's The Bag. Post multiple times a week, obviously limited to the requirements of characters and captions, so less than 2,200. So you're not going to get the full depth of a story there. But if you want to subscribe, it's for free. Free newsletter available at newbagdrops.com. And yeah, I'm accessible. I respond to DMs, I respond to emails, and I think it's really important the work that you guys are doing, Jay.
Oh, thank you.
Highlighting these different stories and kind of honing in on what you think is important, and clearly people believe in your taste.
I appreciate that very much. Nathan, let's talk again. I really appreciate your time. And once again, kudos. Fantastic piece on that most misleading stat. Thank you, brother.
Hey, thank you. Take care.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.